May I ask you to come to the stage, please? Thank you very much. And a round of applause for Lord Lamont of Lerwick.
Tim, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I was asked if I would talk a little bit about the Eurozone and then talk about Britain's relationship with Euro and the prospect of Britain leaving the EU, something which I see from market reports is beginning to get increasing attention. The Eurozone is, as Tim said, a subject that is of great fascination to me personally, not just for the reason he gave, but actually I was Britain's negotiator when the Euro was set up, and I spent a whole year of my life trying to convince my European colleagues that I was genuine when I said we had no intention of joining the Euro. And I used to spell out the reasons why I felt the Euro was a flawed concept. I used to talk about the lack of mobility of labour in the continent, the absence of a government, the absence of a single treasury, therefore the absence of a fiscal union, and we didn't believe that you could have a single currency without having a fiscal union, and we didn't see how you could have a fiscal union and have national parliaments as well. And so, for all those reasons, plus I think the very important fact that we strongly felt that different economies had different structures and different sensitivities to interest rates, not least because of the different housing markets in the different European countries. But we used to have these meetings once a month, and this went on for a whole year. I can honestly say it was the dreariest year of my life. It was a complete dialogue of the deaf, and I would rehearse these arguments. I do remember very late, about 3 in the morning during these negotiations, at one point, Mario Draghi said to me, well, a lot of what you say has force. There's a lot of logic in what you say, but believe me, whether you like it or not, this is going to happen. And that taught me one lesson about the Euro, which is that it is politics. It's all about politics, and it's all about history. For France and Germany, it is very much about 3 wars in 100 years and not repeating that experience. And that may seem far-fetched, but that was the genuine, I don't criticize it, I don't sneer at it, it was the genuine vision of Mitterrand and co. And when German reunification happened, this was what Mitterrand wanted. It was once very well put to me by a Spanish economist, Pedro Schwartz, the Spaniard with a German name, and he once said to me, you know, the Euro has much more to do with Freud than it has to do with any economist. And I said, now why is that? He said, well, the reason the Euro exists is firstly, the French are afraid of the Germans, secondly, the Germans are afraid of the Germans, thirdly, the Italians don't trust themselves, the Irish want to be rid of the British, the Portuguese and the Spanish want to be French, the Greeks want to face the Turks in the eyes, and the Dutch, the Belgians, and the Luxembourgers all want a seat at the top table. And I thought, well, the only thing he's left out of that is, of course, and Britain doesn't think it need to have anything to do with this, because it won the war all on its own, of course. But I think that does illustrate a lot of what the psychological and historical attitudes to the Euro are. People are often today puzzled, and people in Britain are often puzzled, by the fact that something like 70%, according to opinion polls, of Greeks want to remain within the Euro. But I think for Greece, as for Spain, and as for Portugal, the Euro is a badge of modernity. It's a badge of European citizenship. It is putting the military dictatorships that you had in those 3 countries firmly in the past. It is seen as underpinning the democracy of a modern state. And I think it's very important to bear that in mind, that this is essentially a political project, and it's not going to be abandoned precisely for that reason, because it is political. And although I've always been very critical of the concept of the euro, I've never ever forecast its early breakup. There are plenty of historical precedents, they go on for quite a long time, but I've never been one of those forecasting its early breakup. I had a look at what was in the conference brochure by Jean-Pierre Casey about the euro, and he was, in the little bit that I read quickly, saying that it wasn't really dominated by Germany. I'm not sure that I really agree with that. I remember so vividly when the currency was being set up, almost everything was designed to emulate the institutional architecture of Germany. The ECB was modelled very, very strictly on the Bundesbank. Then there were articles to say there should be no monetary financing, something that, of course, Germany, for historical reasons, has been strongly opposed to. There were the no bailout provisions. They didn't last long, did they? But they were built into the treaty, the no bailout provisions, because Germany was extremely worried at that time, not about Greece, we weren't sure whether Greece would join, but about having to stand behind the debts of Italy. And then there were the various rules about deficits. Of course, all these rules were sometimes followed, sometimes applied too rigorously. That has been the history of the whole project. Now, when the financial crisis struck in 2007, 2008, the Eurozone initially thought that it was immune from this crisis. This was all the product of Anglo-Saxon excess. Its origin was in Germany and in Britain, and it was not going to infect them. That was what they thought. But it didn't take very long before the evidence pointed in a different direction. And what then appeared was that just as in the United States, just as in Britain, you had in Ireland, in Spain, and Portugal and Greece excessive lending, particularly to the property sectors. You had the property bubble. This then affected the banks. And you then had the ricocheting of debt between the sovereign and the banks who had to be rescued by the sovereign, and the sovereign who borrowed from the banks, and the debt situation got worse for both. Then, of course, we had the bailouts of Greece and Ireland. I must say, when that happened, that really did surprise me, because written into the treaty setting up, the Maastricht Treaty setting up the single currency, there is an absolutely explicit, unambiguous, no bailout clause. And Madame Lagarde just admitted quite recently that actually the bailout of Ireland and the first bailout of Greece were almost certainly illegal, because there was this provision of no bailout, and the way they managed to get around it was they used a provision in the treaty which was designed for natural disasters like earthquakes and floods in order to justify the granting of money to Greece and Ireland. But that again is, I think, an example, and perhaps it's grounds for optimism about the future of Europe. Whenever there is a problem, they're not going to be restrained by the rules. They will find a way around it. When you come to Greece, I think Greece, of course, is a very special case. Probably Greece should never have been allowed to join the euro in the first place at the very beginning. It does appear that previous Greek governments were not entirely honest about the state of their finances, but I think the mistake was allowing Greece ever to join in the first place. The idea that the Greeks would become like the Germans, that Greece could ever be fully competitive within the straitjacket of the single currency, could become competitive with Germany, I think was a very ambitious idea. Nonetheless, I think the degree of austerity that Greece has been asked to follow, the path of austerity, has really been so heavy that it is hardly surprising that it has produced the very strong political reaction that it has. When you consider the beginning of this crisis, if you compare the situation of Britain and Greece, both had comparable, similar deficits in relation to GDP, around 12% of GDP. Britain, and we read in our newspapers every day of how we're supposed to be undergoing massive austerity, has reduced its deficit from 12% of GDP to 5% of GDP. Greece is being asked to run a surplus. It is running a surplus, and meant to be running a surplus of 4% from now to the year 2023. Hardly surprisingly, the results of this policy on Greece have been extremely severe. In the UK, we've seen GDP contract during the last recession, peak to trough, 6%. Greece, the economy has contracted by 4 times that amount. And whereas we've had modest increases in public sector pay of 1%, in Greece they've actually had benefits cut in absolute terms, pensions cut in absolute terms, numbers of civil servants cut in very large numbers of terms, and unemployment and youth unemployment have gone through the roof. Of course, this has not helped the problem of indebtedness, because as the economy has shrunk, the ratio of indebtedness to GDP has increased to the skyscraping level of 170%. I don't say that this is unpayable ever, but I think the idea that Greece would run a surplus of 4% while having 25% unemployment all the way to the year 2023 is something that is really quite unrealistic. And many people at the time of the creation of the euro did forecast that this was the sort of austerity, this was the sort of bias towards deflation that would happen in the Mediterranean countries in Europe. And this was most markedly forecast by Martin Feldstein, the Harvard Nobel Prize-winning economist, who argued that the euro, far from creating peace in Europe, would actually increase tensions between Europe, because different countries would be making incompatible demands on common institutions. And that, I think, is largely what has happened. To me, it's not surprising that we've had the upturned cars, the flames, the riots, the pictures of Mrs. Merkel in Nazi uniform. To me, if anything, the mystery is that it didn't happen earlier, or that it hasn't happened in other countries. Tim asked me, when he was introducing me, about Mr. Varoufakis, the rock star Greek finance minister. I met him a few years ago when we were both debating the euro in Australia, actually. And I was arguing that the euro, in the best of all possible worlds, probably ought to be abandoned. He was arguing that it shouldn't, but halfway through his speech he just tore up his speech and said, well, actually I agree with Lord Lamont, but the truth is we can't get out of it. And that, I think, is the truth. I've always said the euro is like a lobster pot. You can crawl into it, but it's very, very difficult to turn around and find the exit. And you're stuck with it once you're there. But anyway, I carried on emailing and debating the Greek situation with Yanis Varoufakis. And then about 6 or 7 weeks ago, I received an email from him which said, you'll probably be as surprised as I am to know that if opinion polls are right, my life is going to take an unexpected turn. And tomorrow morning, by a large majority, I shall become a Member of Parliament for Athens. He added, and even worse, I'm going to be given the poison challenge of Finance Minister. Whatever will I do now? And I think Syriza, which is a coalition of different groups on the left, but has formed a coalition with a party of the right whose sole point of agreement with Syriza is a lessening of the austerity package. that party has drawn into Greek politics many people who weren't in politics at all before, but have been aroused by the situation that faces Greece. And the mandate of Syriza is to lessen the austerity package and to seek an alternative way, but above all to reduce the burden of debt. The original Syriza demand was that the burden of debt should simply be written off. It has the merit of simplicity, but they've now modified that to talking not about the writing off of debt, which would be simple, but to altering the net present value through the usual smoke and mirrors devices that you would all be familiar with. It's a question of who was going to blink first, and I think everybody would agree that it's Syriza who have blinked first. They had to agree to a short-term package in order to have the option of going into the negotiation for the longer term. The longer term is the negotiation that will conclude in July, in 4 months' time, where maybe they will get a debt swap, or they will get an alteration in the terms of their financing. But in the meantime, the Germans particularly, and Mr. Schäuble in particular, have been adamant that Greece should stick to the package of reforms that was agreed by the previous government. Syriza have not been prepared to accept that, but they seem to have signed up to something like 50–60% of those supply-side reforms, but leaving another 30 or 40%, which will be ones that they from the left are going to substitute for the reforms that were previously put forward by the previous Conservative government. This all has to be decided, this short-term package, very soon, and there could be problems there because both the ECB and the IMF are not satisfied with the amount of detail. I think the IMF are under particular pressure because a lot of third world countries are complaining to Mrs. Lagarde about the degree of assistance that was given to Greece. Normally there is a particular multiple of a country's contribution or quota to the IMF, and it's been vastly greater in the case of Greece, and there is a feeling on the behalf of many people that this is only because this is a European country that they've been given help by the IMF on those terms. And so I think there is scope for a lot of problems here, but I think it is by no means guaranteed that we won't see in July a complete repeat of the nervousness in the markets and the risk of a breakdown in negotiations. There's no doubt, though, that the Greeks want to stay in the euro for the reasons I stated earlier, and because that is the will very much, according to opinion polls, of the Greek people. You often read in British newspapers, people compare the situation in the euro that Greece is in with Britain in the ERM, the situation when I was Chancellor. But I don't think the comparison between the two situations is really remotely applicable, because the degree of financial integration in Europe is much greater today. I think you have to look at the consequences of a Brexit, not just of the impact on the Greek economy, but the impact it would have on the rest of Europe. And next time that there is a crisis relating to Spain or Portugal or Ireland, if one country had already left, I think it would be inevitable that the markets would be saying, is this going to be the second country to leave? I've been interested that the Germans have been arguing that this isn't correct because the creditors to Greece are largely official creditors, and actually the euro might be stronger if Greece left, but I can't believe that they are so indifferent to the knock-on effects which could in the end lead to the unravelling of the euro. Now, I just talked so much about Greece, well, really because I've seen a little bit of Mr. Varoufakis recently and have been very interested in it. But despite my thinking that maybe the markets have been a little bit complacent in just forgetting about Greece and just assuming that this can be fudged out of existence, I do think, as I said in the notes to your programme by Mr. Casey, I do think that the outlook for the Eurozone generally in the short term is rather better than many people had been anticipating. I think the IMF are forecasting an increase in Eurozone growth this year of 1.5%. I wouldn't be at all surprised if that wasn't considerably bettered. Germany and Spain are performing strongly, both grew by 0.7% in the last quarter. But all these forecasts were made before, obviously, the fall in the price of oil, and of course we still have to see the effects of Mario Draghi's quantitative easing, the 60 billion a month that is meant to be starting this month. I'm a little bit sceptical about quantitative easing, and I'll be interested to see what effect it really does have on bond yields and peripheral bond yields. But it certainly seems to have an effect on equity markets, which is what most people in this room are interested in. And I'd be very surprised if we don't actually see some good news on that front. I want now just to talk a little bit about Britain and Europe and the prospect of a referendum on Britain's membership of the EU. I, of course, look at this from the point of view of a politician. And what strikes me when I consider Britain's relationship with the EU is how it has always, from the very beginning, been a fractious relationship. You often see on television, I think I saw it again on Sunday night, a famous film of Winston Churchill's Zurich speech, where, according to the commentary, and you get this every time, Churchill urged the United States of Europe. But you know, when you look at that text, as opposed to the film they show on television, what Churchill actually said was we need to have a United States of Europe between France and Germany, but Britain will never be part of it, because Britain has a different psychology, Britain has worldwide interest, Britain looks to the wider world. But again and again, this speech is misquoted, both in print and on television, as being the great man's support for a European federation of which Britain would be a member. I think in Britain, even after we joined the EU, and I made my first speech in the House of Commons in favour of our joining the EEC, but the emphasis has always been on the economic. We've been much less keen on the politics. And of course, since we joined the European Union has changed a lot. It's changed its name from the EEC to the EC to the EU. And of course, it's become much more involved in a whole series of areas, employment, sometimes using the single market legislation to force through laws to do with other areas, justice, policing, foreign policy. The EU now has something like 250 embassies throughout the world, even though we're in theory don't have a common foreign policy. But it has intruded into more and more areas. I think polls show, not just in Britain, but throughout Europe, an increasing disillusionment with Europe. Partly this has been because of the experience of the Eurozone, but the rise of UKIP in this country has been mirrored by the rise, obviously, of other parties with a similar bent in other European countries. Here, I think, distrust of the EU has been fueled by witnessing what's happened in the Eurozone that has made people more cautious. I think many British people are more comfortable with Britain being close to the United States than to the EU, but of course that is rather ironic because the United States government is very firm, Republican or Democrat administrations, that it sees the interests of the United States in having its close ally Britain within the EU. But that is an issue. I think one reason why attitudes to Europe in Britain are somewhat more accentuated than in other European countries is to do with parliamentary institutions, the role that Parliament plays in the life of this country and the accountability that it produces. And that accountability is very difficult to find reflected in European institutions. And opinion polls show that a minority of people, but a growing minority in this country, have become dissatisfied with the EU, wanted to leave, various reasons, too much regulation, the cost of membership. We pay something like £13 billion a year in gross terms, the cost of regulation. According to some economists, the burden is equivalent to 5–6% of GDP. Of course, Britain's relationship with the EU is different from that of many other members of the EU because we have a whole series of opt-outs. We have an opt-out from the single currency, we have an opt-out from some aspects of justice and home affairs, the social chapter. Sometimes I've wondered whether the EU isn't really going to leave Britain rather than Britain leave the EU, because each time it acquires more powers, Britain seems to have an opt-out from it. I think one of the issues, as I say, that is very salient in this country is the effect on lawmaking and on Parliament. It was a few years ago that Jacques Delors, the President of the Commission, made the forecast that 80% of laws in this country would actually come from the EU. I don't think that has come to pass, but the very fact that he said that at the time had a very considerable impact on British public opinion. And of course, we're confronted with a situation for the European Parliament in which Britain has only 7% of the votes, is acquiring more and more power, and will seek to have more and more power in the future. Now, I make all these points because part of what I wanted to do is just to explain the background, explain the history, explain, insofar as I can, I attempt to understand it, where the public get its attitudes from and why they have them. And it is in response to that that David Cameron decided that it would be right for Britain to attempt to renegotiate the terms of its membership. David Cameron has made it clear that he wants Britain to stay in the EU, but he wants it to stay in the EU on a renegotiated basis. And therefore what he is putting forward as a proposal is that if there is a Conservative government or a Conservative government in a coalition, and he will only be in a coalition if this can be accepted, he would seek to renegotiate the terms of our membership, repatriate some powers, and then put the result to a referendum to endorse or otherwise Britain's continued membership. Now, what would be the objectives in a British negotiation? I think they are threefold, really. The first is to ensure that measures that are taken within the Eurozone to prop up the euro don't have a spillover effect to affect Britain. The Eurozone constitutes within the voting structure of the EU a majority. So if the Eurozone decides that certain measures of harmonisation are necessary in order to protect the euro, those laws could apply to Britain, whether they were relevant or not. This was clearly an issue that arose in the recent so-called banking union. And one way around this would be insist on a double majority. A majority within the Eurozone and a majority within the wider Europe if you are to have measures that apply to both. But that will be one objective, to build a wall between the legislation of the Eurozone and the rest of the UK. The second objective will be to try to repeal some legislation in order to make labour markets more flexible, more competitive, measures like the Working Time Directive. A third objective will be to give more power to national parliaments, to give them the right to veto proposals if 2 or 3 national parliaments are object to a proposal coming from Brussels, that they could have the ability either to delay or to block that legislation. I think the government, if they get in this position of negotiating, will go for measures that don't require treaty change. If you have a treaty change, that requires a referendum according to the constitution of several countries. So if you had to change the treaties in order to accommodate Mr. Cameron, you might have to have a referendum in Ireland or Holland. And so I think they will try to go for measures that can be achieved without actually making changes in the treaty. They won't be going for measures on immigration in the negotiations. That seems to have been abandoned. They looked at that and then decided that was too difficult. I do think Germany will very much be an ally of Britain in these negotiations, because there are certain things that Britain and Germany have in common in terms of economic philosophy, and I think Germany would be very put out if Britain actually found itself in the position of wanting to leave the European Union. You may say, what bargaining cards does Britain have? Well, I think it has 2 that, however infuriated, and I'm very well aware of this, having played the awkward boy at school in the EU many years myself, however irritated the Europeans are by Britain, they don't actually want it to leave. They won't say so, but it wouldn't do the prestige of the European Union much good in the wider world if the second largest economy within the EU left. And secondly, the other card they have, is they know that the British government have, is that it's not entirely within the hands of the British government what the ultimate decision is. Mr. Cameron has made it clear he wants Britain to remain in. He will recommend in a referendum, if there is one, that Britain does remain in, but ultimately the decision would be for the British people. Lastly, if there were a referendum and there were a vote for withdrawal, how do I think that would affect the British economy? Well, I certainly think it would be problematic, but I'm far from convinced that it would be the overwhelming disaster that many people say. Britain would continue to export to the EU. I think it's very noticeable that even Switzerland, I know a lot of Swiss businessmen would actually prefer that they joined the European Union, but it nonetheless remains a fact that Switzerland, without being a member of the EU, manages to export per capita more than the UK does, is more integrated into the EU economy than Britain is, and its integration is growing more quickly than that of Britain. Even countries that are outside the EU, like the US, Japan, have managed to exploit the single market, and their exports at times are growing more rapidly than our own. When it comes to manufacturing, given that Britain runs a very large deficit in manufactured goods with the EU, I can't really see that we would be at enormous disadvantage in any negotiations, and I think some of the fears expressed over, for example, the automobile industry are somewhat exaggerated. The most problematic area, and it's a very big area, would I think be services, and in particular financial services. But there again, the truth is, the argument is often put, get in there, argue your case, be constructive, and you'll win your case, and you'll look after your interests. But the point, unfortunately, is that with the regulation of the financial services industry, we've lost a lot of battles rather than winning them. And I think it's rather evenly balanced, whether we lose more being outside than inside. You know, we didn't do very well on the Alternative Investment Directive, we didn't do very well on the Financial Transactions Task, and we did hopelessly on bankers' bonuses. My impression, that people in this room will probably tell me I'm wrong, is that opinion in the city is quite divided. I think the banks are very nervous about this, very nervous that the central banking might move to Frankfurt or Paris. I think the hedge funds are much less worried. My impression is that the insurance world is divided. It's notable that some people in the asset management field, like Helena Morrissey or Chris Benodi, have been outright supporters of withdrawal if necessary. The one thing I don't think would happen is that we would see a huge drop-off in foreign investment, because there would still be access to the single market. And I remember very vividly when we were making our decision not to join the euro, how at the time that we made that decision not to join the euro, we were endlessly told, night after night, on the 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock news, Toyota say they'll never come to England again, Nissan say they'll never come to England again. We were told foreign investment would dry up, and it did not. I do think, however, whatever I may feel about it, that there would be a lot of anxiety, there would be a dent to confidence. I do feel that that might be overplaced, but I always remember what Lord Keynes said about confidence. He once made the remark that if businessmen believed that the arrival of swallows was bad for business, the arrival of swallows would be bad for business. And we have to take account not just of the reality, but of what people believe. Now, I've probably thoroughly chilled the blood, alarmed you, terrified you. What do I think the outcome of any referendum is going to be? Well, let me give you a word of cheer. I think, by and large, referenda the world over tend to support the status quo. It's very unusual for referenda to go the other way. Secondly, opinion polls have shown that in the last few months already, with the shadow of the referendum appearing, support for the EU has increased and support for withdrawal has gone down. I also think very much when there is actually a referendum campaign, the voice of business will be very large in it, just as it was in the Scottish referendum. I think one of the key factors in independence being rejected for Scotland was the number of companies that were saying it would be bad for their business, so I think there will be plenty of opportunity for business to make its views known. So my guess would be that Britain will vote to stay in. Everybody will make up their own mind. That's how I think it would probably come. But the one thing I would say is that may not be the last word forever. Thank you very much indeed.
Superb. Thank you so very much there, Lord Lamont. We've got some questions for you. The one question I put to you earlier on, you're not going to reply to. You're not going to say whether you're in favour of an exit or not until you know what the outcome of the negotiations are.
I'm sorry, I should have, basic point I should have made. I'm going to make up my mind on the basis of the outcome of the negotiations.
Well, listen, I know there'll be lots of questions for you. Who'd like to speak first? This gentleman right down there. Super.
Thanks very much for that, Lord Lamont. You did say, when talking about the process towards the vote, the referendum on Europe, that David Cameron would recommend to the British people that they stayed in, without conditionality. Now, surely he's got to have the negotiation first, but if I was a cynic, which obviously I'm not, he will go to Angela Merkel and say, listen, you've got to give me something to take back to the British people. I promised them a referendum. Give me some scraps that I can take to them and make out that this terrific concessions have been made. And then I can recommend that they vote in favour of staying within the EU. And sort of, by the way, I only had to offer it because I had to see off the UKIP threat. And having promised it, I've got to go through with it. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I'm sure David Cameron has been having a lot of talks with Mrs. Merkel and has begun to approach this subject, and I'm sure he has explored with her what areas concessions might be made. The point we make, can you really negotiate if you don't make a threat to withdraw? That was one of the points you were making. A lot of people have said what you said, but of course, I think he would say, well, it's not my threat, it's the British people's threat. I may argue that we should stay in, but ultimately it's not me who makes the decision. People won't be guided just by my recommendation. If this is a cosmetic, shallow, trivial renegotiation, people will judge that for themselves. And the people on the other side of the table can't be certain that actually the British people won't vote to go out. So there is a degree of uncertainty there. But a lot of people have made the point that you've made.
Do you know, I should ask for a vote, actually, first of all, which is, amongst us here, how many of us think that prospects for Britain would be, for Britain, first of all, would be harmed if there was a vote to withdraw from the European Union. Could you put your hands up if you think it would be harmful to Britain? Those who don't think it would be harmful to Britain, put your hands up now. Okay. And let's be communitarian like this, and use that French word, and say, would it be harmful for Europe if Britain left the EU? Yeah. Would it be not harmful to Europe if we... Okay, well that's interesting. It's a very communitarian sort of attitude as well. Got a gentleman over here with a question.
Lord Lamont, thank you very much for the talk. As I understand it, there isn't really any formal mechanism for countries to leave the EU in some sort of ordered way over a period of time. Is it time to consider...
Sorry, I can't hear. So it's echoing.
Sure. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
So as I understand it, there isn't any mechanism for countries to leave the EU in an ordered way. Is it time to consider some sort of mechanism as part of these negotiations so that Greece, for instance, could leave in an ordered way rather than creating chaos in the financial markets?
Well, you use the phrase leave the EU. There is a provision in the EU treaties for leaving the EU that was made, I think, at the time of either I think it was the Treaty of Nice, the third or fourth treaty, a special, I think really as a result of some British pressure, this was inserted, but actually it wasn't really as a result of British pressure, but it was really people in Brussels saying, well, our British friends will like this if we put it in, because they're always making the point you've made. They're always saying there is no mechanism for leaving, and surely there ought to be a mechanism for leaving. So it does exist for the EU. There is no mechanism for leaving the Eurozone, however, but the Eurozone is intended to be irreversible. And of course, it wouldn't be very easy to write into law any mechanism for leaving the Eurozone. It would be extremely difficult to do. If the ECB decided to stop funding Greek banks, that would be it. But that's a decision that would never be made by the ECB. It would be made by the politicians rather than the ECB.
Thank you, Anthony. Dean, thank you for the question.
Thank you. Thank you, Lord Lamont. Excellent talk, really. There seem to be two major irritants for people in the UK, and I wonder if Cameron would be able to renegotiate this. Number one is on immigration, the free movement of people, which is central to the EU, and the second is the creeping amount of justice that, the legal system, for example, the human rights. It's good in a way, but it harbors a lot of funny people, shall we say, who get away with a lot of things. Could these two things, Human Rights Act and the immigration, be renegotiated by Cameron, or is it a no-no?
Well, the issue of human rights usually refers to the European Court of Human Rights, which is a Strasbourg institution. It isn't a European Union institution, but Britain complies with the charter of the ECHR. You know, there is an argument over whether we should just enshrine this in British law and not pay so much attention to the rulings of the Strasbourg Court. But that does not have much to do with the EU. I say does not have much because actually the EU now has its own Charter of Fundamental Rights, which echoes a lot of the ECHR's charter. But at present it is largely a non-European Union issue, which the government are looking at to see if they can modify the influence of it. On immigration, I said that David Cameron had decided not to make immigration part of the renegotiation. He initially was talking about having an emergency break. An emergency break would mean that if one country is growing quite strongly, as Britain is at the moment, compared with other countries in the Eurozone, and therefore the argument is Britain is attracting a lot of excess labour in countries with high unemployment, that when you have an exceptional situation like that, you should temporarily be able to impose some modest restriction on the amount of immigration into the country. But the free movement of labour is regarded as such a fundamental principle of the EU that I think Cameron found out very quickly that this was not going to be negotiable. He then moved to the alternative policy of looking at the conditions under which welfare entitlements are paid to immigrants and toughening those up, and was arguing that this would be a deterrent to large-scale immigration. Actually, I'm very sceptical whether there's any effect at all, and most immigrants come here in order to work. But that is the only way in which immigration, I think, would feature in the renegotiation.
Now, annoyingly, we do absolutely have to be out of this hall by 8:30, so I can't take any more questions just now. But Lord Lamont is going to be here for a short period afterwards for some drinks and a little chatter. I'll just end by asking you that question from Yanis Varoufakis, then, Lord Lamont, which is the evidence of your friendship, is there evidence of the ironies of life? Left-wing, right-wing, solidarity.
Well,
did it surprise you?
I explained, I met Mr. Varoufakis, I like to say I met him in a bar in Australia, but that's not quite true. I met him at a seminar in Australia, and then we went to a bar. But he is a very intelligent man. He went to Essex University and then Cambridge, then the University of Texas, then Sydney University, and then Athens University. But he has considerable affection for Britain. He calls himself an erratic Marxist. I don't think he's really a Marxist at all. I've studied economics at Cambridge, and I can tell you by the standards of the economics faculty at Cambridge University, he's not left-wing at all. But he's left-wing enough to be the finance minister. But he does, as you may know, have this one characteristic that he never wears a tie. And when he came to London recently, I did arrange a series of meetings for him with people like people in this room. And first of all, I arranged the meeting. He said he was going to stay above the station in Liverpool Street, which rather surprised me. It seemed a strange place to stay. So I said, well, where will we have our breakfast with all these investors? He said, we'll have it in Liverpool Street. So I arranged it there. Then he suddenly phoned up and said, well, I've had a security tip-off. We've got to live in the Intercontinental Hotel now. So we moved to the Intercontinental. I said, we'll have the breakfast in the Reform Club. And then I remembered that the Reform Club only allows people in if they wear a tie. I emailed him and said, well, will you wear a tie to breakfast? Because I'd never seen him wear a tie in his life. And no reply came. I sent another one, will you wear a tie to breakfast, please? Then one came back saying, well, I might come naked to breakfast. Anyway, we had to move it to the Sofitel because the Reform Club, even though it's changed its rules to allow people not to wear ties, it hasn't yet come into effect, and we weren't going to anticipate the
Lord Lamont of Lerwick, thank you very much indeed.